By early 1944, the war in the air had entered a new phase, one that no longer depended solely on bullets or bombs, but on invisible pulses of energy echoing across the skies. The Allies had learned to speak the secret language of radar, and with every passing week, they grew more fluent. The once invincible German night defenses, once so precise that British crews called them Iron Curtains, now began to stutter and fail. The reason was simple, but devastating. The Allies had turned the electromagnetic spectrum itself into a battlefield. Every night, new code words spread through the RAF's operations rooms: window, carpet, mandrel, pipe rack. Each represented a piece of a larger strategy to blind, confuse, and overwhelm the Luftwaffe's detection network. Window, thin strips of aluminum foil dropped from bombers, created a blizzard of false echoes on German radar screens. Mandrel emitted powerful radio noise that blanketed entire frequencies. Pipe rack transmitted fake bomber formations, tricking night fighters into chasing ghosts across the darkened skies. By spring, the German radar chain that once guided night fighters to their prey had become a web of chaos. Luftwaffe controllers shouted conflicting bearings, interceptors circled empty skies, and batteries of searchlights swept wildly, chasing shadows. The precision that had defined Germany's air defense had dissolved into noise. Even the most seasoned radar operators began to lose faith in their instruments. They had been trained to trust what the screens showed, and now the screens lied. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, that deception reached its masterpiece. In the early morning hours, as over 5,000 ships crossed the English Channel toward Normandy, a second phantom invasion appeared on German radar. Along the coast near Calais, where Hitler believed the real attack would come, Allied bombers dropped endless streams of window, while a fleet of small boats towed metal reflectors and radar jammers. Operations Glimmer and Taxable convinced the German High Command that an entire invasion force was forming there. Even when the first reports from Normandy began to arrive, many German officers dismissed them as another trick. For hours, precious, decisive hours, reinforcements stayed put, waiting for an invasion that never came. The success of D-Day was not just built on bravery or planning, it was built on illusion. The Allies had mastered the art of electronic deception, turning Germany's greatest technological strength into its blind spot. The war that had begun with dogfights and bombing raids was now being decided by physicists, mathematicians, and radio engineers. In laboratories from Malvern to Massachusetts, a new generation of scientists worked tirelessly behind blackout curtains. Men like Sir Robert Watson Watt, who had pioneered early radar, now oversaw efforts to create countermeasures that could evolve faster than the enemy's detection systems. On the other side, German engineers like Wilhelm Runge and Hans Hollmann tried desperately to close the gap. But by 1945, it was clear. The Allies' industrial power had fused with scientific innovation in a way that no nation could rival. When Allied troops finally crossed into Germany, they found the remnants of this invisible war scattered across forests and fields. Concrete radar towers half destroyed by bombs, experimental antenna arrays buried under snow, and laboratories filled with unfinished prototypes. Many of those discoveries were quietly packed onto ships and flown to Britain and America, feeding the next generation of military technology. Among them were early designs that would inspire not only Cold War radar systems, but also the birth of modern stealth and electronic warfare. For the men who had fought in the skies, the change was profound. No longer could a pilot rely solely on his eyes or reflexes. Victory now depended on invisible forces guiding him from hundreds of miles away. Radar had changed not only the battlefield, but also the very psychology of war. It introduced uncertainty, deception, and the idea that control of the unseen could outweigh control of the seen. In post-war years, many of the scientists who had worked in secret found themselves shaping the modern world. Radar technology gave birth to civil aviation control, weather forecasting, and even the first computers. The same mathematical minds that once designed jammers and reflectors would later build the systems that now guide airplanes, predict storms, and connect continents. And yet, beneath the progress, the moral lesson of the radar war remained hauntingly clear. Every tool of protection could also become a tool of illusion. The invisible victories of World War II had opened a door that humanity would never close again, a world where truth itself could be engineered. In the ruins of Rechlin and Peenemünde, where so many of Germany's wartime dreams had turned to dust, a few broken radar screens still flickered as Allied engineers explored the sites. For a moment, the static hum of their dying circuits seemed to whisper the story of the entire conflict, a war where light and shadow had traded places, and where the side that mastered the unseen had conquered the visible. As the decades passed, the legacy of that invisible struggle endured. Every modern aircraft that slips unseen across the sky, every satellite that watches silently from orbit, and every electronic signal that protects or deceives, all trace their lineage to those desperate years when radar ruled the night. In the end, the war of machines became a war of minds, and the victory belonged to those who could see what others could not.
By the summer of 1945, the world had changed in ways no one could have imagined 6 years earlier. The skies that once burned with tracer fire were now filled with silence, and the laboratories that had once built weapons for destruction began to build machines for discovery. The radar war had ended, but its echoes shaped everything that followed, from the Cold War to the space age. In the immediate aftermath of Germany's surrender, Allied intelligence teams fanned out across Europe in a massive operation known as Alsos and Surgeon. Their mission? To locate and secure every piece of advanced technology the Third Reich had created. From radar laboratories buried beneath the Black Forest to half-destroyed test ranges near the Baltic, they found blueprints, prototypes, and a generation of scientists who'd lived through a war fought in wavelengths and frequencies. These discoveries would become the foundation of Western electronic warfare and early aerospace programs. In a warehouse near Hamburg, British engineers uncovered fragments of a device they had never seen before, a rotating radar antenna powered by vacuum tubes capable of real-time scanning. It was the prototype for a 3D radar system, decades ahead of its time. Across the Atlantic, American scientists examined the Wurzburg Giant, Germany's massive tracking radar, and realized its precision could be adapted for missile guidance. Within a few years, that same concept would guide rockets into orbit and beyond. But perhaps the most dramatic shift came not from the machines themselves, but from what they represented, the dawn of the information war. During the conflict, victory had depended on who could see first, jam faster, or deceive better. After 1945, those same principles became the currency of global power. In Washington, London, and Moscow, intelligence agencies grew out of wartime code-breaking and radar divisions. Secrecy, signal interception, and countermeasures became peacetime weapons. In this new world, radar evolved beyond detection. It became surveillance. Early warning networks stretched across continents. The Dew Line, built through the Arctic, watched for Soviet bombers, while new radar-guided missiles patrolled the skies. The technology that had once saved convoys in the Atlantic now guarded entire nations. Yet even as it protected, it also deepened the fear of what might come next. The same invisible waves that once guided pilots to safety could now guide nuclear warheads. For the men who had built the first radar systems, this transformation carried a heavy irony. Many of them had dreamed of a peacetime future powered by their inventions: weather tracking, air traffic control, navigation. Those dreams did come true, but always under the shadow of the war that had given them birth. As one RAF scientist later said, "We learned to listen to the sky, and we've never stopped." In Germany, the story took a different turn. As part of Operation Paperclip, several leading radar and rocket scientists were quietly moved to the United States. They worked alongside American engineers at newly founded research centers like MIT's Radiation Laboratory and White Sands Missile Range. There they helped develop radar-guided missiles, early warning systems, and eventually the computers that would run them. Others, captured by the Soviets, contributed to the USSR's own radar and defense programs, ensuring that the invisible war continued, this time between East and West. Back in Britain, the scientists of the Telecommunications Research Establishment, the same men and women who had built the Window and Mandrel systems, turned their wartime discoveries toward peace. They created the first weather radars, mapping rainfall over the British Isles. What had once been a weapon to hide planes now became a tool to predict storms. The transformation was both symbolic and profound. The instruments of deception became instruments of understanding. Yet as the Cold War intensified, radar's darker side returned. By the late 1950s, nations were blanketed in overlapping radar grids, each one watching for the other's bombers. In some control rooms, operators sat for decades waiting for a signal that, thankfully, never came. The very success of radar, its ability to see beyond the horizon, had created a paradox: security through perpetual fear. Decades later, when stealth aircraft emerged, the SR-31, the F-117, and beyond, they were in a sense the spiritual successors to the paper drop tanks and radar jammers of World War II. The same principle applied: control what the enemy can see. But this time, it wasn't about blinding radar, it was about bending it. The electromagnetic shadows that had once protected bomber fleets over Germany had evolved into a science of invisibility. And still, the legacy reached further. Modern satellites, GPS systems, and even smartphones trace their ancestry to the wartime laboratories of Malvern, Bawdsey, and Rechlin. Every weather forecast, every air traffic control screen, every guided missile, all whisper the same origin story: a war that taught humanity to see the unseen. Looking back now, the radar war stands as one of the most transformative chapters in human history, not for its destruction, but for its revelation. It showed that the true battlefield lies not in the ground we stand on, but in the information we can command. The men and women who once bent over cathode ray screens in darkened rooms unknowingly built the foundations of the modern world, one pulse, one echo, one reflection at a time. In the quiet that followed 1945, when the last echoes of radar faded from the night skies of Europe, a new age began, the age of signals. An age where power would no longer be measured in tanks or planes, but in data, perception, and control.
By the dawn of the 1950s, the echoes of the radar war had evolved into something larger, a quiet technological revolution reshaping the modern world. The devices once built to detect bombers now watched weather systems, guided ships, and scanned the heavens. But beneath this progress ran a familiar undercurrent: competition, secrecy, and the constant fear of falling behind. What began as a wartime innovation had become the nervous system of a new kind of global conflict: the Cold War. In the West, radar engineers who had spent the war perfecting jammers and detectors now found themselves recruited into sprawling military-industrial projects. Laboratories in Britain and the United States buzzed with activity as new generations of scientists expanded radar into realms no one had imagined during the dark days of 1940. Long-range warning systems could now detect aircraft thousands of miles away. In New Mexico and Nevada, test ranges shimmered with the energy of experiments that merged radar with rocketry and atomic science. In 1954, a network of early warning radars began to rise along the frozen edges of North America. Known as the Distant Early Warning Line, or DEW line, it stretched from Alaska to Greenland, a wall of electronic eyes watching for Soviet bombers. The line represented both safety and paranoia. Engineers braved polar winters to keep it running, their screens glowing in isolation as the Arctic wind howled outside. Each echo on the radar carried unimaginable consequences. A single blip could mean the beginning of the end. Across the Iron Curtain, Soviet scientists raced to match and surpass this growing web of Western surveillance. In Moscow's secret laboratories, they developed radar systems capable of tracking high-altitude jets and guiding supersonic missiles. The invisible war had returned, only now its stakes were global and its weapons far deadlier. Radar, once used to guide bombers toward enemy cities, was now the first line of defense against total annihilation. But amid this tension, radar also became humanity's first tool for exploration beyond Earth. In 1958, as the space age began, radar signals were bounced off the moon for the first time. The faint echo that returned, delayed by over 2 seconds, marked a new frontier, proof that humans could reach across space using invisible waves born from war. Within a decade, those same principles would track spacecraft heading for Mars and Venus. The radar that once guided destruction was now guiding discovery. Meanwhile, civilian life transformed quietly. Airports across the world installed radar towers to manage the booming age of commercial flight. Weather radar became a fixture in every meteorological station, turning once unpredictable storms into measurable patterns. For the first time, humanity could see nature's movements with the same precision once reserved for animal bombers. Farmers planned harvests around radar maps. Pilots trusted its green screens to guide them through fog and darkness. The pulse of innovation born in secrecy had become part of daily life. Yet in military circles, radar was entering a new paradox. The very success of detection had created the demand for invisibility. The question was no longer how to see, but how not to be seen. Experiments in the 1960s and 70s introduced radar-absorbing materials and angular aircraft designs that could scatter radar waves instead of reflecting them. The result was a new generation of aircraft that could cross borders undetected, the birth of stealth. In this way, the legacy of World War II's invisible war came full circle. The same ingenuity that had once blinded the Luftwaffe's defenses now built machines that could vanish from radar entirely. The ghosts of the 1940s, the false echoes of Window and Mandrel, had returned, this time made of titanium and jet fuel. Every stealth bomber that slipped through the night sky carried within it the same philosophy that once guided the paper drop tank: simplicity, deception, and speed. For the scientists who had lived long enough to see it, the transformation was bittersweet. Many had dedicated their lives to improving radar as a tool of protection and knowledge, only to see its ultimate counterpart, the art of disappearance, emerge from their own discoveries. In memoirs and late interviews, they spoke of pride and unease in equal measure. "We built radar to make the skies visible. Then we taught the skies to hide again," one British engineer said. By the late 19th century, radar had woven itself so deeply into human civilization that few stopped to think of its origins. It guided ships across oceans, planes across continents, and spacecraft across the solar system. It monitored rainfall, tracked hurricanes, and even mapped the surface of distant planets. The technology that once decided the fate of nations now quietly defined the rhythm of modern life. And yet, the moral of its story remained unchanged. Every invention, no matter how noble its purpose, carries the shadow of its origin. Radar was born from fear, the fear of surprise, of invasion, of the unseen. And from that fear came understanding, progress, and power. Humanity learned to listen to the invisible world, and in doing so, reshaped its destiny. Today, when a plane lands safely in a storm, or a satellite scans the Earth from orbit, or a telescope maps a distant asteroid, a faint echo of that wartime discovery still lingers. Each pulse, each reflection, each invisible wave is part of a story that began in darkness and ended in light. A story of how humankind learned not just to see, but to perceive. In the end, radar's legacy is more than a machine or a system. It is a reminder that every invention, no matter how noble its purpose, carries the shadow of its origin. Radar was born from fear, the fear of surprise, of invasion, of the unseen. And from that fear came understanding, progress, and power. Humanity learned to listen to the invisible world, and in doing so, reshaped its destiny.
By the 1970s, radar had become both guardian and gatekeeper of the modern age. The world had entered an era defined not by open war, but by vigilance, a tense equilibrium maintained by machines that never slept. Across continents, radar stations pulsed day and night, their spinning antennas sweeping the skies for anything that moved. To most people, these installations were just distant towers on lonely hills, but to those inside, they were the front line of a silent standoff that could decide the fate of humanity in seconds. At the height of the Cold War, the skies were alive with signals. American AWACS aircraft, flying radar command centers, orbited high above oceans, their domed sensors capable of tracking entire fleets. Soviet radar stations mirrored them from the other side of the world, scanning for intruders and guarding missile fields. Between them hung an invisible web of power and paranoia. Every echo, every trace, every flicker of interference could trigger alarms that rippled through command bunkers thousands of miles away. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 had already shown how fragile this balance could be. A radar misreading, a false signal, or even a weather balloon could be mistaken for an attack. Both sides lived in fear of the invisible, not of what radar saw, but of what it might see. To counter that uncertainty, computers were brought into the loop. The SAGE system, a vast network of early computers in the United States, linked radar stations through high-speed data lines. For the first time in history, human eyes were not the only ones watching the sky. Machines now interpreted the radar pulses, making decisions in milliseconds. The human race had created an automated guardian, and in doing so, taken its first step toward the age of artificial perception. While governments built their walls of electronics, private industry quietly reimagined radar's potential. In the hands of scientists, it became a tool of exploration and preservation rather than fear. Oceanographers used it to map currents and track icebergs. Archaeologists found lost cities buried beneath deserts. Astronomers aimed radar at planets, bouncing signals off Venus and Mercury to measure their distances with unprecedented precision. The same electromagnetic waves that once guided bombers over Europe now reached across the solar system, turning war's invention into a bridge of discovery. By the 1980s, radar had evolved into something almost poetic, a dialogue between Earth and space. Deep space radars could detect asteroids millions of miles away, while ground-penetrating systems revealed the hidden layers of our own planet. In military terms, radar became smarter, faster, and more selective. Phased array systems could shift focus instantly, tracking dozens of targets without moving a single dish. Stealth aircraft, meanwhile, pushed the technology to its limits. Every advance in detection created a new challenge in invisibility. The race between seeing and not being seen became the defining technological duel of the late 20th century. In 1991, during the Gulf War, this invisible rivalry played out in real time. Allied stealth bombers slipped through Iraqi radar networks, striking with surgical precision. On the screens below, operators saw nothing but static and ghosts, a chilling echo of the Luftwaffe's confusion nearly half a century earlier. History had come full circle. The electromagnetic battlefield, once born in the laboratories of wartime Europe, now defined modern warfare. And yet, For all its power, radar also revealed humanity's fragility. Accidents and false alarms continued to remind the world how thin the line between vigilance and catastrophe could be. In 1983, a Soviet early warning radar falsely detected incoming missiles from the United States. One man, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov, refused to believe it. Trusting his instincts over the machine, he prevented what could have been a global nuclear war. The radar had done its job too well. It had seen something that wasn't there. By the turn of the 21st century, radar had transcended its military roots entirely. It became a part of everyday life, embedded in cars to prevent collisions, in satellites to monitor climate change, in phones to sense gestures in motion. The technology that once decided life and death now quietly assisted humanity in everything from navigation to rescue operations. In hospitals, medical radar measured heartbeats without touch. In nature reserves, radar tracked migrating birds across continents. The silent pulse of progress had become the heartbeat of civilization itself. Still, the past lingers in every echo. The hum of a radar dish turning in the night carries the same rhythm as those that once stood on the cliffs of Dover or the shores of Normandy. The operators of modern systems, whether guiding aircraft or tracking storms, are heirs to a legacy forged in fear and ingenuity. They too stare into glowing screens, interpreting the unseen, trusting in reflections and data to tell them the truth. As the digital age unfolds, radar's essence remains unchanged: to illuminate what cannot be seen, whether guarding the skies, exploring the cosmos, or revealing the secrets beneath the earth. It continues to bridge the known and the hidden. It reminds us that the most powerful discoveries often begin not with sight, but with curiosity. The human need to reach into the dark and ask, what's out there? And so, from the forests of wartime Germany to the satellites orbiting above, the story of radar is the story of perception itself. A journey from fear to understanding, from secrecy to science, from destruction to connection. It is a legacy written not in ink or stone, but in waves, invisible, enduring, and eternal.